We got another minute, sorry. I'm just, for whatever reason, Zoom is still loading my screen here. I've never seen that before, so. We'll see how it goes. Alright. Alright, so first things first, I did get your first set of Launchpad assignments, grades transferred over as of around 1 o'clock yesterday. So if you did anything last night, it may not transfer, although it looks like some people's were starting to automatically transfer, so that's exciting. So remember that you have some freebies there, so if you don't like your scores you got on the initial ones, then feel free to do other ones, and I'll exclude the ones with the not great scores. I saw that some folks are working ahead, probably working to get everything done under the free trial. Awesome. Your grades should stay no problem as soon as you're done. And again, I made sure they're transferring over to Blackboard, so you should definitely be good. So today we're going to start talking about research in psychology. I'm going to go ahead and take attendance, dive on in, and then letting you all know up front so that I also remember I need to stop around 2 p.m. today because it is conferences at my daughter's school. So I got to go find out how she's doing. I think she's doing fine, but you know, for 4.5-year-olds, who knows? So hopefully she's just not like beating up the other kids. Alrighty. So Caitlin, Kylie, Oliver, Nora, I saw, Caitlin, Micaiah, Matthew, Kimberly, Fabiana. I'm starting to like, even if I can't like consciously remember, my head's starting to go where in the room you guys sit, so that's a good sign. All right, Cameron, Grace, and Emily, Jada, I don't think I saw today. Sarah, oh, there you go. Olivia, hi, I saw. Daryl is supposed to be zooming in. I don't know if she was able to or not. The Zoom seems to be acting weird. David, Samantha, and Jenna. Awesome. Like I said, after this week, I think I'll be able to just check y'all off using the picture thing. But the problem is the pictures they use I think are y'all's like, when you first get on campus, your ID pictures, so some of you do not look the same at all, which isn't a bad thing, but I'm like. Sure, just like. My ID still has my picture on it from when I got here 13 years ago, and I look like a baby, so. Alrighty, so today, like I said, we're gonna start talking about research, and research methods, and, I was trying to figure out. I'm like, do I call this research methods in psychopathology? Do I call it research methods in clinical science? And I decided to roll with that to re-emphasize that psychology is a science. And that even when we're studying things that seem more on like the touchy-feely side of psych, like therapy, disorders, things along those lines, we're trying to do so in a scientific way to produce a valid data that will actually help us make informed decisions. Alrighty, so these are some of my favorite quotes. If you're taking an intro or another like 200 level class with me, you've seen these before. So this is why we need research, because otherwise quotes like this would just stand. So Aristotle said, the brain is an organ of minor importance. I think we would all argue with that now, right? But at that point, they didn't really know what the brain actually did, whether that was good, bad, or indifferent. Over 100 years ago, Charles Duell in the US Patent Office said, everything that can be invented has been invented. Right? I mean, no, right? We hadn't gotten to that point yet. And sometimes just like in the moment, it's hard to see outside of where you are and what could happen in the future. And then in 1977, Ken Olson said, there's no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home. Again, I've just pointed out 2 computers, one of which fits in my pocket. I don't know if you know, I've heard this, but this has more computing power than the computer in the spacecraft that took the Apollo astronauts to the moon. Like mind-boggling, right? But at that time, the computers would have taken up this room and probably the room next to us, right? Like computers were these giant servers. So that made sense. He couldn't foresee a future where computers became this size, and definitely not where computers became this size, right? So we need to keep researching, we need to keep questioning, we need to keep having some curiosity about things. So what is research? It's the systematic search for facts through the use of careful observations and investigations. So we are looking for the truth, whatever the heck that is. Scientists acknowledge that it's really hard to find facts and find the truth. And scientists sort of acknowledge that any theory, any idea, just kind of one article away from being questioned, one study away from being questioned. And so we want to always make sure we're using rigorous methods to test our theories or techniques on representative groups. Psychology and other fields that use human participants have been very bad at this historically. Even now, the vast majority of psychological research is produced at large universities. Oftentimes there's what you call mass testing, where like everybody in intro psych, and like where I went to grad school, the intro psychs were like 500 people each. I'm not joking, they took up like an entire auditorium. And they have everybody in there, fill out questionnaires and get data from that. The problem was where I went to grad school was about 90% white, right? So we're missing the experiences of people of color. We're missing the experiences of people who can't afford to go to college, right? We're missing large swaths of the population. And so psychology as a science is trying to be more conscientious about that. But I will fully admit to you, we're not always doing a great job, honestly. I'm very lucky because if you look around this room, you can see we're pretty diverse, except if I want to study guys. It's really hard to study guys because there's like 2 of you in this room, right? And so I have to go beyond psychology, and then you don't have the motivation of extra credit. But in general, if I want to study, issues in college women, I get a pretty diverse sample, which is awesome. But a lot of people don't have that benefit, so they have to stretch themselves to find that. And a lot of people don't think of it, which is really, really sad. Don't want to do it, which is really, really sad. Or want to do it, think of it, but don't have the funds, right, to recruit and adequately compensate those individuals. So there are barriers that get in the way. They shouldn't be excuses. This should be a priority within all fields that study things in humans, including the medical field. We also have a lot of challenges beyond that. When we're doing clinical science, right? When we're studying the human mind and human behavior and human emotions, we're trying to do things like measure unconscious motives. So like if the person doesn't even know what they're feeling or thinking, how are they supposed to tell us, right? We're also doing things like trying to assess private thoughts. So that person might not feel comfortable sharing those with a stranger, right? This is why a lot of, especially survey-based research in psychology, is moving to completely anonymous. So like my studies, I put on SurveyMonkey, I make sure the IP address is turned off, we don't collect that. And then they link to another study, another survey for compensation. So there's no way to attach name or anything to your data, so people hopefully feel more comfortable reporting, but some people still don't want to tell you about what they've experienced. And the other thing is monitoring mood changes, right? So like, when does my mood go from to like, no, I'm happy, right? That could be really, really tricky. And there are creative ways that clinical scientists try to get at this, including using techniques that involve like apps on your phone, or you might take surveys multiple times during the day, things along those lines. But it's certainly not a precise. When I used to give like in-class study, closed book exams, I used to joke with my students, I wish I just had like a scanner. I could like scan the back of your head and know how much you knew, and then I wouldn't have to give you a test. Number one, that's creepy, so I wouldn't want to actually do that. But number two, it's just so hard to, we've all had that experience where you're on a test and you can like almost see where that information is in your notes or in the book, but you can't actually get it out. So it could be a struggle to measure these things, and we fully acknowledge that. And that's just, again, something like knowledge. If you have someone with psychopathology, let's say you have someone with paranoia, they're going to have a hard time participating in your research. If you have someone who has been part of a traumatic experience, they're going to be really guarded, right? Things along those lines become challenges that we have to think of scientific ways to overcome. And so we use the scientific method. Just like any science, we're going to do science in this rigorous way. And this involves systematically gathering and evaluating information. Systematically gathering and evaluating information. And we do that through careful observations to gain an understanding of a phenomenon. So through careful observations to gain understanding of a phenomenon. And observation is a very wide term that can mean lots of different things. In psychology, it can mean literally observing someone's behavior. Sitting behind one of those one-way mirrors and watching a kid play and documenting things. It can also mean giving someone surveys. It can also mean doing an experiment and recording responses. So there's lots of different ways that observation can happen. And also, increasingly, observation can also be facilitated by technology. We use VR for a lot of like anxiety therapy tech now, treatments. And then we also are doing things like brain scans to see which parts of the brain are active when you're doing certain things. And so science itself is the pursuit of that systematized knowledge through the observation. And the objectives of science are trying to describe. So in psychopathology, this would be your initial description of what are the symptoms of the disorder, how do we decide whether someone has this disorder or not, things along those lines. Prediction of what the outcome will be. So if I'm going to be doing therapy with someone, my prediction should be they're going to get better, right? One would hope. But we have to actually test that to see if that's the case. We also try to control any variables we can control. So for example, if I'm doing a study about memory, and this actually happened to a colleague of mine, they were using a couple different sites, and at one of the sites, there was construction outside the building. And it was like, I think, a very young grad student, and they didn't think like this might be a problem. And so they actually had to throw out the data from that site, because if you're testing like memory and concentration and attention, and there's like jackhammers going on next door, it's not an accurate representation unless you also introduce jackhammers everywhere else, right? So we need to be thinking about things like that. And then understanding, and I would say this is the majority of the research that's done in psychopathology now, is trying to understand why do these disorders occur? Is there a way we can prevent them? What is the experience like for someone with this disorder, and what can we do? What can be done to decrease people's anguish, right? That's something that will come up over and over, is that these disorders interfere with people's lives, right? And that is really problematic. Now, the basic scientific method, many of you may be familiar with, but the idea is you start with a theory. This may be one you come up with, or it may be an existing theory. Like, so for example, one of the theories I use quite a lot is social comparison theory. Came up in the 60s, 50s, actually, I think. And the idea is that people compare themselves to other people to see how they're doing. But the problem is, the original theory kind of said, if it's not beneficial, you'll stop comparing yourself. And modern studies, and particularly those looking at like appearance-focused comparison, I compare my body or my face to somebody else's, people still do them even if they're harmful. This is people of any gender, any race, what have you. And so, you know, I start with that theory, and I'll come up with my own theory. Leanne Festinger came up with that in the 50s. Don't need to reinvent the wheel. But then based off that, you come up with the hypothesis for your specific study, right? So what am I going to do to test this theory in a new way, right? So for me, for example, for my dissertation study, I was looking at those in the moment social comparisons. So it's unfortunately like right before smartphones got big. So we had to give people Palm Pilots. Oh, that really dates me, I know. And they were very buggy. We had like a bat phone, participants could call us on when they acted up, not if, when. Right, and what we were looking at is when you make an appearance-focused comparison in your day-to-day life, does that lead you feeling worse about your body? And then what we were adding in was this element called body checking, where this is a behavioral part of body dissatisfaction, where you actually might do things like put your fingers around your wrists to see how big it is, or check if your thigh is, or things like that. The biggest one that most people do is if you walk by a reflective surface, you'll kind of be like, how's everything going, right? Like, dude, straighten that, right? And so we were looking at that in particular. So from the hypothesis, you're going to come up with that method. So I just explained mine, right? We're doing these Palm Pilots. We're having people fill out surveys 5 times a day related to that. From that method, you're going to get some results. In our case, we did find that after you made one of these appearance-focused comparisons, particularly what we call upward, so you're looking at someone who you think is better looking than you, you are going to engage in that body checking more often. So based on the results, a couple of things can happen. We found a cool finding. We found kind of what we expected to find. So then I guess I'll just use the word publish. A lot of times in clinical science, you'll see the word disseminate. It's a big word. But disseminate just means like tell other people about it. So there's different ways you can publish it. The most common way in science is to write it up in a journal article, have it peer reviewed by people who are expert in the field, go through some revisions, and then get it published. You can also publish it in a book. You can publish it on Twitter now. A lot of scientists are starting to, particularly when their articles come out, tweet about them and try to spread science that way. You know, there are lots of different things you can do. Present at conferences, posters, talks, things along those lines. But let's say you did not get the results you expected, or you didn't get anything significant, like there's just nothing to look at. Well, what you might do then is go up and say, maybe my hypothesis is wrong. Maybe social comparison doesn't affect body checking. It only affects how you feel about your body. And so then you might alter that and go through. And if you keep finding over and over that you're not finding the results you want, you may eventually have to go back up and revise the theories. And that's certainly how a lot of science is done. There are lots of things that are old theories that we can kind of laugh at now, right? You know, people were alive at the time of the dinosaurs, and you do carbon dating, and you're like, oh no, these look like millions of years apart. But you know, just things that we learn as techniques advance. There's certainly a ton we don't know about the brain, about people, that as our technology advances, we're going to be able to discover in very different ways. And so generally in research, what we're looking for is what's called a nomothetic understanding. Think of nomo as coming from the same root as name. So this essentially means like a definitional level understanding. Let's understand this concept overall. Now, when you're taking clinical science and applying it in the room with the client, you're instead looking at an idiographic understanding. Idio, think of I, me, individual, and that is this person in front of me right now. What's going on with them? How can I help them based on the existing science? There are many, actually, I have a video that I found that I want to show you all. You know, a lot of people still think psychology is just like laying on the couch and talking. And certainly there are types of therapy where you do that, right? But psychology is certainly a science. And there's this quick video that talks about it.
Hello and welcome to SciShow Psych. I am Hank Green, one of your hosts, and twice a week we will be here exploring the science of what makes humans tick. That's right, I said it, psychology is a science. People have been debating this pretty much since psychology started back in the 1800s. You can sort of see why people might think psychology doesn't count as a science. The study of the human mind is often missing the tightly controlled experimental conditions and conclusive results that you'll find in other fields like astronomy or chemistry. And yeah, psychology research can be tricky because brains are complicated, but it's still a science. Now, defining science is surprisingly hard because there's no standard definition everyone agrees on. But most people would probably agree with this. Science is systematically observing natural events, then using those observations to develop laws and principles. Then those principles are tested through the scientific method, that list of steps you probably learned in your first science class: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, analysis, and conclusion. Still, these are really just basic guidelines, and most branches of science will operate a little differently from one another. Like particle physicists can't directly observe the Higgs boson. Instead, they rely on statistics to know it's there. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that physics isn't actually science. The so-called rules of science all depend on the type of work a scientist is doing, and psychology is no exception. Psychology is the study of the human mind and behavior, and there are lots of different ways to do that. But any good psychologist can demonstrate that their research follows the scientific method just like biology or chemistry. After observing patterns in human behavior, psychologists usually develop a specific, testable hypothesis about why that behavior happens, or they might create a scenario and see if it leads responds to certain behaviors. Then, if they want to find correlation between variables, that a certain event and behavior are related, they'll conduct a field experiment where they carefully observe subjects in normal, uncontrolled circumstances. Or if they want to determine causation, whether or not a certain event actually triggers a behavior, they'll create a rigorous, highly controlled, and replicable laboratory experiment. Next, they'll use statistics to analyze relationships within those data, and to make sure the findings are reliable, the experiments are often repeated under the same conditions. Sounds a lot like science, right? People who don't believe psychology is a science will usually say that psychology isn't rigorous enough, that data are often inconclusive or can be interpreted in too many ways. They might also argue that the definitions in psychology are too abstract to be accurately tested. For example, how do you define happiness? People define it differently depending on their culture, their circumstances, or even what day it is, so how can researchers objectively define it? Also, how can you objectively measure or quantify something as abstract as happiness? Another argument is that the results in psychology can't be reliably reproduced because people change every day. But psychologists account for those things. Like, even though you can't directly measure abstract concepts like happiness or anger, psychologists operationalize them, meaning they create, validate, and test a functional definition that serves as a good substitute for something abstract. Going back to our happiness example, they might study it by tracking how often a person smiles or laughs. Or they could have people rate their happiness on a scale from 1 to 10, or track the amount of endorphins in their system. All of these are useful for different reasons and offer valid, valuable data. Also, a lot of arguments against psychology miss the whole point of the field. Psychology isn't looking to capture a universal human experience, because that doesn't exist. Humans are messy. You're influenced by so many things, from your culture to your circumstances, and even that book you read all the time back as a kid. Creating broad, strict rules for human behavior would miss a lot of the nuance and detail found in different people and situations. So as long as researchers acknowledge that their work is limited by the differences between people and take that into account in their analyses and conclusions, it's not an issue. At the end of the day, psychology is a science, just like biology or chemistry or particle physics. But there is plenty of pseudoscience out there, self-help books and advice columns and websites that make claims about psychology that are totally false, and it can be hard to separate fact from fiction. And that is part of why we're starting this show. Humans
I'm going to just talk about the show a little more. So that's SciShow Psych on YouTube. If anyone's interested, if you don't mind, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And so there is a lot out there. One of the things I've done in this class in the past, I've sort of stopped doing it because people get it pretty quickly, is show a video about the book and the idea of The Secret. So if you guys aren't familiar, it's like, if you just think about something enough, it will happen. And like, sometimes it does because you worked for it, right? But sometimes, and most times, it's not going to you're not going to manifest it into being. There are other pseudoscientific things that are really problematic and even dangerous, like people claiming you can cure depression by taking this totally unregulated drug, right? That no one's actually tested. We want to be careful about that stuff like that. And again, if we do research on it and it shows that it works, so there's research going on right now, for example, about microdosing on hallucinogens, mushrooms, things along those lines. And if that shows that that is an effective treatment against depression and is safe, let's use it, right? But let's not just tell people go and take some hallucinogenic mushrooms you get off the street, right? Without adequately testing that for safety. All right, so one of the ways, and really the first research method in psychology, was the case study. And so this provides a detailed interpretive description of a single person's life and psychological problems. It can serve as a source of new ideas about behavior. And so, for example, Freud's theories are entirely based on case studies. It can be a really good inspiration there, like jumping off point for future research, and that it can offer tentative support for a theory, or it can challenge the assumptions of an existing theory, or it can inspire new therapeutic techniques. The other reason and why case studies are still used till today is that they can offer opportunities to study unusual problems. So later in the semester, we'll talk about dissociative identity disorder, what they used to call multiple personality disorder. I have three excellent supervisors that I knew while I was in my 5 years of training, who each said in their 20+ years of their career had seen one case of DID. You're not going to be able to get a sample of 100 people and study them, right? So you might write up that unusual case. One example of a case study is that of little Hans. Little Hans was a young boy who was frightened of horses, who went to see Freud. Freud decided that little Hans' fear of horses was linked to his Oedipal complex, like you do. And so he thought this had to do with like his fear of castration anxiety from his father. And Freud said that the fact that little Hans had once seen a horse fall in the street right next to him and was terrified by this experience was insignificant. Behaviorists would probably disagree, right? And then one of the prominent people who studied individual cases was Alois Alzheimer. So near the early 1900s, he described a patient experiencing symptoms of forgetfulness, disorientation, and a general decline in functioning. The patient he would describe was later referred to as having Alzheimer's disease. And so because he used a case study to first describe it, then we realize this is something we should be studying and more comprehensive research can be done on it. All of these methods, just like our theories we talked about, are going to have their own limitations. So as you can imagine, there's a big opening within a case study for bias, not only on the perspective of the observer, the person writing the case study, but also on the person who's being studied, the reporter. So for example, little Hans's father was a great fan of Freud's work. He had read all of Freud's books. And so he tended to report and emphasize information that supported Freud's theory and ignore, de-emphasize the information that didn't. This can be even less sort of problematic. Sometimes it's just you as the client really like your therapist. And they're like, I'm going to do a case study about XYZ. And so even though they didn't say, frame it this way, you start to like do it in a way you think your therapist will like. So, you know, there are some holes in this book, but there was a book that came out several years back about Sybil, the famous case of DID. I'm going to talk a lot about DID today. Apparently, I didn't expect that. Something just comes to me. And one of the things that came up, and when they went back and sort of reanalyzed the history and looked into Sybil's past, is that her therapist said at some point to Sybil, I'm only going to study multiple personality disorder now. It was still called that back then. And then like Sybil had never reported any other personalities, and then all of a sudden she had them. Right? And did Sybil intentionally create those? It's unclear. But suggestible people have been known to have personalities emerge under the influence of very well-meaning people who are treating or supporting them. Case studies also obviously rely on subjective evidence rather than objective things. And this means they have very low what's called internal validity. Internal validity is the accuracy with which you can rule out all possible causes except one. With a case study, that's nearly impossible, right? Because you are looking at one person's life, they got a lot going on, just like Hank Green was talking about. Humans are very complex and influenced by a lot of different things. Case studies also provide little to no basis for generalization. So although they describe a specific individual in great detail, the information is often relevant only to that particular individual being described, and it doesn't generalize to all people with the disorder. This means it also has low external validity, and external validity is another way of saying generalizability. Sometimes in psychology, we come up with fancy words, and I don't know that we always need to, let's be honest. All right. So a very commonly used method in psychology is the correlational method. Correlation is the degree to which events or characteristics vary with each other. It measures the strength of a relationship between two variables. And the variables are assessed as they exist in nature. You're not trying to manipulate them at all. You're just measuring them as they are. So a good example of a correlational study might be having someone fill out a questionnaire about stress and another questionnaire about depression. And then you statistically compare their scores on those two scales and see how those variables relate. So you're not making the person stressed out. There are ways psychologically you can do that. So for example, one of the things psychologists do to stress people out is give them math problems or word problems that actually have no solution, but tell them there's a solution. They debrief them later and tell them you're not dumb, it wasn't possible to solve. But you can create stress that way. You're also not trying to make the person depressed. And yes, we have techniques we can use to not really induce depression, but induce sadness, playing sad music or a sad video clip. And again, you'd want to play a happy video clip afterwards to bring them back out of it. So you're just measuring how do stress and depression exist in this person right now. I have in my notes probably one of the most important things. No, the most important thing to remember about correlational studies is what's in bold and all caps here. Correlation does not imply causation. So that means if we find out someone has a high level of stress and they also have a high level of depression, we can't say, oh, the stress caused them to get depressed or the depression caused them to get stressed. Because it could be because they're depressed, they're stressed out because they're not doing things like going to class because they're depressed. Or it could be because they're stressed out and they don't know how to cope with it, they become depressed. Or there could be some variable we're not even thinking of, like they've just had a loved one pass away. And so not only are they depressed about that, but also there's often a lot of stress involved with like settling someone's estate and planning a funeral, right? So we can't say one causes the other. This is the most egregious mistake, misrepresentation the media makes consistently. There will be results of a correlational studies, and you'll see on the news, recent studies show that eating chocolate causes you to get high, or like, no, it's like live longer. That's a really common one. Eating chocolate lives to a longer lifespan. And typically these are just correlational studies, right? We can't say there's cause and effect unless we like from birth randomly assign some people to eat chocolate and some people to never get to eat chocolate. That sounds cruel and unusual to me, right? So we can't say one thing is causing the other, only that they tend to vary together. It's also important to consider the magnitude of the correlation. So this gets confusing for folks because it feels very counterintuitive. But the weakest correlation is zero. Zero, there's no correlation between variables. -1 and +1 are equally strong. It just tells you which direction the two variables vary with each other. And I have some charts that will illustrate this in a couple of slides. So the closer correlation is to either -1 or +1, the stronger the relationship between the two variables. The closer it is to 0, the weaker the relationship between the two variables. Again, to the point that a 0 correlation literally means there's not a relationship between these variables. So I have a very brief video here from the movie Freakonomics, where they're talking about correlation and causation.
Freakonomics. Well, hi there, boys and girls. This is Captain Kangaroo. Say, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. So, you know, it's lots and lots of fun to have a pet that you can run and play and jump with, isn't it? But did you know that there are some boys and girls who can't run and jump and play? It's all because of a thing called polio.
When I think of bad historical assumptions about correlation and causality, I think of polio 100 years ago, when it was this horrible mystery that it was, you know, claiming a lot of lives, and it was really scary because it mostly struck children. And there was a strong line of research that suggested that ice cream caused polio, that ice cream consumption caused polio.
Here comes Mr. Softy, the soft ice cream man. The creamiest, dreamiest soft ice cream you get from Mr. Softy.
the reason that that correlation was thought to be causal was that polio spiked in the summertime for reasons that really weren't very well understood, but it did. And ice cream sales spiked during the summertime. So these researchers had seen that whenever there was a lot of ice cream being sold and consumed, there was a lot more polio. And so there was really literally the beginnings of this kind of ice cream persecution to try to stomp out polio. And it sounds ridiculous, but you see it all the time now, people trying to fight against or build up something that they're sure is connected to something else, in which it turns out just isn't.
There's a great website that's Spurious Correlations, and things like homicide also correlate with sales of ice cream. And that's because both just happen more in the summer, right? So certainly, things can be vastly misrepresented in a lot of ways, and weird stuff can be related, and it's really just coincidence, right? All right, so a positive correlation, this is that stress and depression example we were talking about. So as your stress score gets higher, so does your score on the depression scale, and vice versa, right? Again, we're not assuming causality, but if you're high on one, you're going to be high on the other. So that is a positive correlation. Both variables move in the same direction, sort of vary together in the same way. The next thing, and I'll just sort of bounce back and forth here real quick, hang on, is the negative correlation. And I want you to notice that if you put a mirror up between these two graphs, they're the same slope of the line, just flipped. And so this would be your activity levels and your depression. And so people who are scoring higher on depression are scoring lower on activity level. And again, it's really tempting to be like, well, that's because people who are depressed, part of the symptoms is they don't go out and do things, so it's causal. But we also know that not going out and doing things you enjoy perpetuates your depression. And again, we could be missing a third variable of like, maybe in fact, the problem is you have broken both legs, right? And you can't go out and do anything, plus it's really depressing to just lay around in bed all day, right? So that is a negative correlation. And again, it's not any weaker or stronger than a positive correlation of, so like a negative correlation of 0.5 and a positive correlation of 0.5 are equally strong. They just mean the variables vary in different directions. That no correlation, that zero correlation is, there's no pattern to the data. They're not varying with each other in a consistent way. So this is depression and IQ. We know that people at any level of IQ can get depressed. We also know that people at any level of depression can range dramatically in their IQ, right? And so again, zero correlation means no correlation. That's the simplest way to think about it. The correlational method has been expanded in lots of different ways. So it's not just giving two questionnaires and looking at them. We can look at things in much more complex ways. So for example, epidemiological studies look at the incidence and prevalence of disorders in populations. Incidence is the number of new cases during a given time. The way I remind myself of this is the N for incidence, N for new. And then prevalence is the total number of cases in a population at any given time. So if we talk about like the incidence of COVID cases, it'd be the number of new cases over a day, a month, a year, however we want to look at it. But the prevalence would be, if we took a snapshot of the country right now, how many people had it, right? How many people would test positive for COVID? And obviously we can look at this with psychological disorders as well. Longitudinal studies are basically correlational studies that are done over different time points. And so you're observing the same participants on many different occasions, often over a very long period of time. So we worked with a data set when I was in my grad school stats class that I believe was spanning 10 years. I started kids when they were like 4 or 5, and we're measuring them into their teen years. They were looking at like ADHD, and a whole bunch of other behaviors and emotions and things like that. These are sort of the gold standard for psychology, but they're not done that often. Could anyone guess why? Just logistically. Yeah, they're expensive. They're so expensive. Because in addition to compensating participants fairly at each stage, you also have to track them down. If they move, right, if they relocate. Yeah, and just for that reason, it's logistically difficult to like keep in touch with all these people. So people don't do them for that reason as well. So again, we would love to do lots of longitudinal studies. Typically, there's only a few done in each field. This is a longitudinal study that looked at depression over the lifespan. Nope, sorry, reverse this. This is the chart showing prevalence. This was cross-sectional. So longitudinal is where you look at the same people over time. Cross-sectional is where you get people of different ages and you pull them all like the same month or whatever. So apologies that I misrepresented that data. Scientists also correct themselves when they're wrong. Alrighty, so next we're going to start talking about the experimental method. Some people consider this the gold standard. In clinical science, experiments can be problematic because you'll see as we talk about them, they naturally create an unnatural environment. And if we're thinking about how disorders and their risk factors play out in the real world, sometimes experiments aren't as informative as we would look for them to be. So the experiment allows for determination of a causal relationship. So you can get causation out of an experiment. And so what researchers do to try to do that is try to eliminate as many extraneous variables as they can, what are often called confounds or nuisance variables. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. But we do that in a host of different ways. One is random assignment to experimental conditions. So let's say we're going to test, we'll use the example I used before, making people stressed out by giving them difficult to solve word problems. So we're going to have a condition where they do those and a condition where people get ones you can solve, right? Random assignment means any person who walks in the door to do your experiment has an equal chance of ending up in either group. You can flip a coin, you can pull a name out of a hat. A lot of times now we do it with online random number generators. And then you manipulate that independent variable. So in the example I was just using, it was the difficulty, or I guess the solvability, right, of those word problems, right? So you're going to find a variable where you can control it. These people are going to have the ones you can't actually solve. The second group is going to have the ones you can solve, right? And then you're going to measure some sort of dependent variable. So in this case, stress, right? If I give people problems that they can't actually solve, will their stress levels be higher than people who have ones that can solve? And there's lots of ways, as again, Hank Green mentioned in this video, there's lots of ways to measure something like stress. You can give people a questionnaire, you can do behavioral observations to see if they're showing like micro expressions of stress. You can check things like your cortisol levels, and that gives you a really good indication of stress. And in fact, cortisol levels are used in a lot of anxiety studies now. And so the independent variable is believed to be the variable that will cause the change. And the dependent variable, and it's called dependent because the idea is it's dependent on that manipulation of the independent variable. It's controlled by the independent variable. So as I was just mentioning, we try to eliminate all confounds or nuisance variables, and these are any variables that are not our IB and our DB. So things like room temperature, time of day, quietness, things along those lines. Age of participants, right? We wouldn't want everybody in one group to be 5 and everybody in the other group to be 20. things along those lines. So you really try to control for as much as you can. If you don't, those nuisance variables can skew your results and have you finding things that aren't really an accurate representation of the question you're trying to ask. And so we use 3 features to try to guard against those confounds or those nuisance variables. The first is that control group. And this is a group of participants who are not exposed to the independent variable, but whose experience is otherwise the same. So this would be the group of people who got the problems you could solve, right? So they're still doing more problems, but they're just doing ones that shouldn't stress them out because they're solvable. By comparing the outcome of the group with the manipulation and the control group, then we can better determine the effect of those word puzzles and how difficult or solvable they are. And random assignment, as I just mentioned, is a big part of that. So ensuring every participant in an experiment is as likely to be placed in one group as in the other. And this can be done with a coin flip, drawing names from a hat, a computer program. A lot of times psychologists use the site random.org to do things like this. And then another thing that we do, particularly if we're doing something like testing treatment, medication treatment, things along those lines, is a blind design. And oftentimes in clinical science, a blind design may be designed around placebo therapy. I'm gonna go ahead and show you all a video.
Research shows nostalgia can help you remember ads. So customize and save.
Liberty Bibberty. At least we get an adorable puppy in the second one. All right.
In 1996, 56 volunteers took part in a study to test a new painkiller called Trivaricane. On each subject, one index finger was covered in the new painkiller, while the other remained untouched. Then, both were squeezed in painful clamps. The subjects reported that the treated finger hurt less than the untreated one. This shouldn't be surprising, except Trivaricane wasn't actually a painkiller, just a fake concoction with no pain-easing properties at all. What made the students so sure this dummy drug had worked? The answer lies in the placebo effect, an unexplained phenomenon wherein drugs, treatments, and therapies that aren't supposed to have an effect and are often fake miraculously make people feel better. Doctors have used the term placebo since the 1700s, when they realized the power of fake drugs to improve people's symptoms. These were administered when proper drugs weren't available, or if someone imagined they were ill. In fact, the word placebo means "I shall please" in Latin, hinting at a history of placating troubled patients. Placebos had to mimic the real treatments in order to be convincing, so they took the form of sugar pills, water-filled injections, and even sham surgeries. Soon, doctors realized that duping people in this way had another use: in clinical trials. By the 1950s, researchers were using placebos as a standard tool to test new treatments. To evaluate a new drug, for instance, half the patients in a trial might receive the real pill. The other half would get a placebo that looked the same. Since patients wouldn't know whether they'd received the real thing or a dud, the results wouldn't be biased, researchers believed. Then, if the new drug showed a significant benefit compared to the placebo, it was proved effective. Nowadays, it's less common to use placebos this way because of ethical concerns. If it's possible to compare a new drug against an older version or another existing drug, that's preferable to simply giving someone no treatment at all, especially if they have a serious ailment. In these cases, placebos are often used as a control to fine-tune the trial so that the effects of the new versus the old or alternative drug can be precisely compared. But of course, we know that placebos exert their own influence too. Thanks to the placebo effect, patients have experienced relief from a range of ailments, including heart problems, asthma, and severe pain, even though all they'd received was a fake drug or sham surgery. we're still trying to understand how. Some believe that instead of being real, the placebo effect is merely confused with other factors, like patients trying to please doctors by falsely reporting improvements. On the other hand, researchers think that if a person believes a fake treatment is real, their expectations of recovery actually do trigger physiological factors that improve their symptoms. Placebos seem to be capable of causing measurable change in blood pressure, heart rate, and the release of pain-reducing chemicals like endorphins. That explains why subjects in pain studies often say placebos ease their discomfort. Placebos may even reduce levels of stress hormones like adrenaline, which can slow the harmful effects of an ailment. So shouldn't we celebrate the placebo's bizarre benefits? Not necessarily. If somebody believes a fake treatment has cured them, they may miss out on drugs or therapies that are proven to work. Plus, the positive effects may fade over time, and often do. Placebos also cloud clinical results, making scientists even more motivated to discover how they wield such power over us. Despite everything we know about the human body, there are still some strange and enduring mysteries, like the placebo effect. So what other undiscovered marvels?
Alrighty, so yeah, what they were saying there is spot on, that a lot of times now the placebo will instead be what we call treatment as usual, because it's often unethical not to give the person anything. So for example, I am involved in 2 clinical trials for vaccines. I mean, one, I think it's pretty much done now because I did it like last March. So one is I got the bivalent booster for COVID about 6 months before it actually came out. And there, everyone was getting the booster, but you just got a different dose of it. They were trying to figure out which dose would work the best. And then I'm in another one for a flu vaccine based on the same technology, the mRNA technology they're using for the COVID vaccines. And that one, you either got the normal flu shot or you got the mRNA one. They were like, let's not give you a flu shot because we know the flu shots help a lot, right? So these are the ethical ways you can do it. And same thing for therapy. Oftentimes in the past, what we do is called a wait list control. So you were told you'll get therapy, but not for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And obviously, now that we know therapies work, a lot of times what we're doing instead is comparing to like the existing treatment that works really well and just seeing if this new one works even better. Again, to be ethical, to be supportive. So one of the problems that can happen is experimenter bias. This is related to a concept called the Rosenthal effect, which is essentially where experimenters may unintentionally transmit their expectations to their participants. So, you could say the exact same script, right? And I'm going to exaggerate. People wouldn't be this different, but you can say, this is a pill and I think it's really going to help you. Or this is a pill, I think it's really going to help you, right? And so what will happen is they'll use what they call a blind design to try to eliminate that Rosenthal effect, try to eliminate the unintentional transmission of that information to the participants. And like this is used very commonly. At one point I commented to the woman I work with closely in the study, the woman who like checks in on me, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I got the mRNA vaccine because I've never been that sick after a flu shot. And she was like, I don't know, they actually don't tell us. So they're clearly using some sort of blind design. So a single blind design is where just the participant doesn't know if they're getting the placebo or the experimental method. A double blind design is where neither the participant nor the researcher in the room with them know. So someone somewhere knows. There's like some principal investigator who knows which one's which, right? But the person in the room with you doesn't actually know which one you're getting. Triple blind design would be if you're having someone do like behavioral observations. So for example, actually 2 different people who I've been colleagues with have told me about studies for kids with ADHD, and a really common method is to observe their behaviors, like how hyperactive are they, right? And so the judges who are doing that in a triple blind design would also not know whether the kid got the treatment or not. Now, these are not entirely foolproof, right? Because sometimes it's really obvious whether someone's getting the treatment or not. So my grad professor who did ADHD studies and told us about them said that the kids would come in and be like, it's a placebo day, because they knew what their bodies were like on their meds and off their meds, right? So sometimes people can tell. Like I said, I'm almost positive I got the mRNA flu shot because I was sick for like 3 days. And I've been getting flu shots since the year 2000 and never had a reaction before. So sometimes you can tell. But the idea is to try to, as much as possible, eliminate some of those biases, eliminate some of those issues, to try to make it as clean as possible. Obviously, for therapy, it's trickier to come up with a placebo therapy. And again, that's why a lot of times now we're moving to, okay, so you're going to use the treatment that, like, our treatment as usual will be the treatment that like the most research supports. And then our new treatment we think will work even better. That'll be the experimental. Alrighty, we'll stop there for today because I'm going to go to a preschool conference. And I will see you on Thursday. We'll keep talking about the experimental method and we'll probably start diving into assessment, diagnosis, and treatment as well.